I finally played Final Fantasy VII. Yes, for almost 30 years, I somehow managed to avoid one of the most influential games ever made. So I thought it was finally time to answer one simple question. Does Final Fantasy VII deserve its legendary reputation? And I think I'm in a rather unusual position to answer it. I have no nostalgia for the game. I had never played a Final Fantasy before, and I grew up almost exclusively as a PC gamer rather than a PlayStation gamer. So this wasn't a trip down memory lane. It was my first experience with one of gaming's biggest classics, judged purely on its own merits. But I know, you want the short version right away. So did I like it? Yes. Final Fantasy VII did not disappoint, and I'm glad I finally experienced it. But it wasn't flawless either, and there were definitely things that didn't work particularly well for me. So let's talk about what it's actually like to play Final Fantasy VII for the first time almost 30 years later. Let's start with my first impressions, and I mean literally what stood out to me during the first hour or so. The first big impact came from the graphics, of course. Now, I know this is a very old game, and I generally have no problem playing older games with all their graphical limitations and quirks. But the contrast between the pre-rendered backgrounds and the chunky, low-poly characters was initially quite jarring. I also sometimes found it difficult to navigate the environments and even recognize exactly what I was looking at. I'm sure playing on a modern LCD rather than the CRT displays of the 90s doesn't help. So, while looking for some kind of CRT filter to ease the pain, I stumbled upon the Seventh Heaven app, and that was a game changer. It allowed me to install a whole series of graphical mods, essentially turning the game into a community-made HD remaster. I definitely recommend checking it out, and I've put the list of mods I used in the description. Even with the improved graphics, though, the presentation initially felt unusual to me. Coming from PC gaming in the 90s, pre-rendered backgrounds, fixed camera angles, and low-poly characters were simply a combination I wasn't used to. But after the opening mission, I quickly started to adjust, and it simply became part of the experience. And I came to appreciate what those fixed camera angles allowed the developers to do. Hide secrets, create small environmental puzzles, and make each screen more interesting to explore. It was a clever way of working around the hardware limitations of the time. Graphics aside, the opening moments of the game are genuinely memorable. You're immediately thrown into a high-stakes situation that already culminates in a boss fight. What a way to start a game! You immediately get the feeling that the story is going to be big and complex. And complex it certainly is, because for quite a while I was left wondering what exactly was happening and why. The game throws names, places, and events at you almost as if you're already supposed to know what they mean. I genuinely started wondering whether I was missing something from a previous Final Fantasy game. Of course, that wasn't the case, but that feeling of not quite having the full picture never completely disappeared. Combat, on the other hand, was fairly intuitive to get into, and luckily so. There is actually a rather thorough tutorial, but you don't encounter it until after completing the opening mission, so for the first 30 minutes or so, you're essentially left to figure things out for yourself. Then again, this was 1997, when games still came with actual printed manuals that you were expected to at least skim through before playing. So perhaps the disconnect was more on my side than the game's. The opening is also remarkably cinematic, with cutscenes that seamlessly blend into gameplay. As a PC gamer in the 90s, I had already experienced games like Wing Commander 3, Privateer, and Gabriel Knight 2, which made heavy use of FMV or had a very cinematic presentation. So even with that frame of reference, I was genuinely impressed by how cinematic and ambitious Final Fantasy VII felt, especially considering the technical limitations of the PlayStation. Overall, my first impression was definitely positive. Despite some initial adjustment, the game hooked me right away and made me want to see where it was going. So, beyond those initial impressions, what were the aspects of the game that I appreciated the most, or that genuinely surprised me by the time I reached the end? The first was definitely the combat system. This was my first experience with what I later learned is called the Active Time Battle, or ATB system, something that obviously wasn't new at all to Final Fantasy players in 1997. My recent JRPG experience comes from games like Octopath Traveler 2 and Persona 3 Reload, so I was expecting a more traditional turn-based system. Instead, I found FF7's combat surprisingly dynamic and engaging. Battles feel like they're constantly moving. You're under pressure while deciding whether to attack, heal, cast a spell, or use an item, and that forces you to make quick, meaningful decisions. My only real complaint is that this pressure becomes considerably less enjoyable when you're desperately scrolling through a massive inventory looking for the right potion while enemies are busy clobbering you. I like being pressured into making tactical decisions. Being pressured because I can't find an item in a menu? Not quite as much, but aside from that, the combat didn't feel old or dated to me at all, quite the opposite. In fact, it made me wonder why more modern JRPGs trying to recreate that old school feeling don't use ATB or something similar. Is it a system that JRPG fans generally don't like anymore? I'm definitely not an expert, so let me know. Another aspect I really appreciated was the variety. Even basic traversal is often made more interesting with little environmental puzzles. You might need to find the right way to reach a chest, discover a half-hidden materia, or even use stealth to avoid guards. Considering how many environments you traverse throughout the game, these little distractions help prevent exploration from becoming a simple journey across nice-looking but substantially empty screens. But the game goes much further than that. Square constantly introduces new activities and gameplay sections that break what could otherwise become a monotonous cycle of exploring, fighting random monsters, watching a cutscene, and eventually fighting a boss. There's tower defense, snowboarding, a submarine chase and battle, chocobo racing. And these weren't things I was expecting at all. They don't all have enormous depth, but they don't need to. They add variety, make you interact with the world in different ways, and keep you wondering what the game might throw at you next. And I think that's one of Final Fantasy VII's greatest strengths. It's constantly finding little ways to change what you're doing and subvert your expectations. That tendency to subvert expectations also extends to the boss fights. In most games, both then and now, you can usually recognize the signs that a boss is coming. Final Fantasy VII, however, sometimes throws you into a major fight with surprisingly little warning. Maybe there's a save point somewhere nearby, but even that isn't necessarily right before the encounter. I really liked this because it added tension, raised the stakes, and made these battles feel like a natural part of the story rather than an obvious boss arena. The downside is that dying occasionally meant replaying a fairly long section, but thankfully that didn't happen too often. Of course, another strength of the game, if not its greatest strength, is the story it tells. It's a big, nuanced story dealing with surprisingly mature themes that still feel remarkably relevant today. Corporate greed, an exploited underclass, and an entire planet being depleted of its resources to the point of catastrophe. It's all very dramatic, and you can feel the weight of your mission from start to finish. But what really makes the story work are its characters. They have distinct personalities, their own agendas, and pasts that shaped who they are and influence the decisions they make. Even protagonists like Cloud and Tifa are far from flawless, stereotypical heroes. They've made questionable decisions, and the weight of those decisions can be felt in their relationships and interactions. Cloud in particular is arrogant, initially has little interest in Avalanche, and at one point even unwillingly helps Sephiroth. Yet he ultimately emerges as a hero, not despite his flaws, but perhaps because of them. His journey forces him to confront who he really is, come to terms with it, and finally accept himself. And that personal growth eventually allows him to become someone capable of helping save the planet. By the end, the story has taken you on such an emotional roller coaster that you're left wondering what ultimately became of these characters and their world. Even the finale refuses to give you a completely clear answer. Did humanity survive and find a way to live in harmony with the planet? Or did the planet ultimately decide to move on without them? And of course, I cannot talk about the story without mentioning one of the most shocking moments in gaming history. It's difficult to go 30 years without coming across such a huge spoiler, so I already knew what was going to happen to Aerith. I just didn't know when. And yet, when I realized that moment had finally come, deep inside I was still hoping it wouldn't happen. That somehow I was the only player in the world who had a copy of Final Fantasy VII where Aerith was going to survive until the end. And I think that's the power of good storytelling. The game makes you genuinely care about these characters, to the point that by the end, it almost feels as though you've actually met them and spent meaningful time getting to know them. Now let's move on to some of the things I didn't like, and that in my opinion haven't aged particularly well. The first is random encounters. Having exploration suddenly interrupted and being thrown into combat when you least expect it is simply something I've never particularly enjoyed. Of course, random encounters were a well-established feature of JRPGs at the time, but I think they would have annoyed me back then just as much as they do today. And they're made slightly more frustrating by my second criticism, the save system. I understand that autosaving became commonplace much later, and my early PC gaming experience was perfectly fine without it. But looking at it with today's eyes, not having even a basic checkpoint before an important boss fight can be difficult to get used to. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes the nearest save point can be quite far from the actual fight. You could almost call it an early version of the Souls-like philosophy. If you die, you replay a whole section, enemies and all, and then have another go at the boss, hopefully without arriving already bruised and battered. Of course, it's nowhere near as punishing as Dark Souls, but that particular aspect of the design definitely feels dated to me. Another issue I had was with the overall structure of the game. As I said, I really liked the story and the tension it generated, but I found the progression somewhat uneven. For a large part of the game, you essentially follow the story from one location to another, with relatively little freedom to wander around. And that makes sense. You're chasing Sephiroth and trying to stop him before it's too late. But then, almost suddenly, the world opens up and gives you much more freedom, just as a gigantic meteor is about to destroy it. I mean, if there was urgency before, surely there's even more urgency now. Yet this is precisely when the game encourages you to revisit old locations, explore optional areas, and discover much of its side content. On one hand, that gives you more freedom and makes you feel connected to the world. On the other, I found that it weakened the sense of urgency the story had worked so hard to create. This is also when you can find some of the best weapons, materia, and equipment in the game. Personally, I would have preferred more of that progression to happen naturally throughout the earlier parts of the adventure. Because when a gigantic meteor is hanging above the planet and humanity could be wiped out at any moment, deciding that this is the perfect opportunity to start breeding chocobos feels just a little bit silly. Not knowing any better, I mostly ignored the optional content and continued with the main story. And that eventually created another problem. For almost the entire game, simply following the main story, fighting the enemies I encountered, and upgrading my characters normally had been more than enough. I never felt that I needed to grind or hunt for particularly powerful equipment. Then I reached Sephiroth's final form and suddenly found myself struggling considerably more, particularly with status effects that some equipment and materia I had never acquired would have made much easier to deal with. And that's where I found the final difficulty spike somewhat questionable. My problem isn't that the final boss is difficult. A final boss probably should be difficult. My problem is that the previous 30 or 40 hours hadn't really taught me that extensive optional preparation would suddenly become so useful. A smoother difficulty curve, or at least a clearer indication that I should prepare more thoroughly before entering the final area, would have made that challenge feel much more natural. Minor gripes aside, I think it's pretty evident that I thoroughly enjoyed playing Final Fantasy VII. It is indeed a great game. And almost 30 years later, I can finally say that yes, it deserves its legendary reputation. It also made me curious to see whether the Final Fantasy games that followed share the same strengths in storytelling and character development, so perhaps I'll eventually give some of them a try. But they'll have to wait. Because after finishing the original, I immediately jumped into Final Fantasy VII Remake. I was simply too curious to see this world recreated in glorious modern 3D and experience this story all over again. This time expanded across 3 entire games. And judging by what I've played so far, I think that's going to be a very interesting experience in its own right. But that's a story for another video. For now, let me know if you agree or disagree with the things I liked and disliked about Final Fantasy VII. And I'll see you in the next one.